And it is to transgender issues that we turn our attention first this morning with the publication today of the Cass report into the treatment of children who are questioning their gender. Language is very important, or unsure perhaps about their gender. Language is incredibly important in this issue, and for that reason we will begin with words, and I think the word that we should begin with is toxicity. It is hard to imagine actually a more ringing vindication, if you like, and I appreciate the dangers of using that word, but a more ringing vindication of those of us who have refused to engage in the vituperative attacks that both sides, and I think today we can perhaps use that word with some confidence, the vituperative attacks that both sides have inflicted upon each other. I don't think we've ever addressed the issue of puberty blockers on this programme, except from, I think, perhaps a very long time ago, a factual perspective, an explanatory perspective. And part of the reason for that is that you can see some, or you could, if you were being honest, see some wisdom on both sides. In short, the idea of administering life-changing, body-changing chemicals to children who are unsure of their gender identity is quite arresting. You think, no, that you should wait until they're older. If you don't want to think particularly deeply about this issue, you could even invent an age now at which you would introduce a blanket ban on all gender treatments, all puberty blockers until that age. And I mean, that's not an untempting position because the biological impact of puberty blockers is so profound. But the other explanation, which I think we perhaps did touch on air, the other explanation is, of course, the postponement of puberty blockers sees the body of the child change more than it otherwise would, which means that if they then pursue life as a transgender adult, they are dealing with issues that would not have been in place had the puberty blockers been administered earlier. And therefore, the umpteenth time, is an illustration of why this is such a difficult territory to explore. If you need another example, then how about this? Who really is qualified to contribute to this conversation except people who started transitioning when they were young, even arguably, because the focus of the report is, I think understandably, on puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. The only people really relevant to this conversation, I think, are the people who've had it, or the families of the people who've had it. And then you're left with a question of statistics, which seems grim, but is there evidence that an overwhelming majority of children who've had this treatment regret it? Or do we pay far too much attention because of, I think, the toxicity of the debate or the way in which some of the media vested interests have stuck their colours to a mast from a very early stage? Do we just focus too heavily upon the, I think, relatively small proportion of people who regret having had this treatment? There's one in particular who had been recently released from a mental health hospital, from psychiatric care, and who was then fast-tracked down a path of puberty blockers, which I think to anybody on the outside, you would think, whoa. So, I mean, the inquiries must be conducted by paediatricians, and they have been. That's exactly what Hilary Cass is. But the people of whom you are asking questions about what has happened, what will happen, and what should happen in the future, you would think would be focused on the people who have experienced the treatment. And that seems to me to be pretty much what she has done. And I can't see a clear way through that. You know that NHS England has already banned puberty blockers and switched to a new holistic model of care in which under 18s experiencing confusion will receive psychological support rather than medical intervention. So they've put the limit at 18, which opens the door to some of the problems that I've just discussed. I think part of the issue, and in fact I wonder as I get older, whether the most toxic territory is the territory where certainty is hardest. If certainty is really hard and you know in your waters, you know in your bones that certainty is close to impossible, something about humanity makes us double down on our own faux certainty. And that, I think, is part of the reason why the conversation displays the toxicity that Hilary Cass describes, I think, so powerfully. I mean, it's actually heartbreaking to read elements of her conclusion and then go online and see people proving her point in spectacular fashion within minutes of the words being published. The toxicity, we'll look again at some of those words regarding toxicity in just a second. And the question I think I'm poised to ask you, albeit that there'll be plenty of room to examine, if you like, the reality of lived experience. I think the question that all of us have an interest in answering is why so toxic? Why has it become such a toxic conversation? And I think part of the answer is we don't like uncertainty. I don't like uncertainty. This, along with the Middle East, oddly, is probably in the top two topics that I find hardest to address because I like to have firm opinions. I like to have strong views. If I've got a strong view, I don't mind if I upset you. If I've done the work, I've done the thinking, I don't mind if I upset you. I used to mind a bit, but you develop confidence in your own convictions. And yet when we turn our attention to this, I do mind if I upset you because I don't have really concrete opinions just two of the reasons that I've already just demonstrated to you, that the tension between providing medical intervention too early versus the tension in providing it too late. And you will know, if you have paid even the blindest bit of attention to this program over the last few years, you do know that I generally steer clear of it for another reason, which we can ignore today, given the national nature of this report. So we can ignore this today. And that is that it is a relatively disproportionate number of people that are affected by this. For the whole of society to take an interest in something that affects such a tiny amount of people is not in and of itself a bad thing, but it is, if you like, a confusing thing for many of us. Even when I watch the switchboard for other programs at this station, that you can sometimes get a shortish queue, usually of men who've got no personal investment or interest in this issue whatsoever, queuing up to talk about it. But apart from that, it is not of interest to people who don't have, and excuse my language, who don't have any skin in the game. You either have passionate vitriol or you have honest confusion bordering on lethargy. It's had nothing to do with me, doesn't affect. And then if you have children of a certain age, the likelihood of them having friends or even perhaps going down a path of gender confusion themselves has increased exponentially over the years. But that's what happens when conversations become more public. That's what happens when stigma is removed. And so there are, in no particular order, a bunch of reasons why this conversation is historically difficult. But apart from my brief flirtation with the notion of being almost uncertainty phobic, humans finding it really difficult to admit nuance or grey areas. And I get that toxicity directed at me when I say that. If I historically say, or I have said in the past, a bit pompous, I don't think I've said anything historic. So if I say, and I have said in the past, that in many of the crucial questions at the heart of this conversation, I can see both sides, that oddly enrages everybody. You probably invite more abuse as a public figure by refusing to pick a side than you do by picking a side. And obviously, there are levels of being a public figure. I don't think anybody has received as much comment in this territory as J.K. Rowling, for example, has, much of which is pretty hideous, but there'll be plenty of people who think her contribution to the conversation has been hideous. To step back and say, I'm not sure about bits of it, I'm not sure about elements of it, is to light both fireworks. It's to light the blue touch paper on both sides of the divide, which I think perhaps is why I haven't found it very fruitful or informative in the past. But today that's what we've got to do. That's what we've got to do. I will keep an eye on my text, but they are moving so quickly already this morning that it will be difficult for me to be completely democratic, if you like. But I'll read you this particular paragraph first, all right? The toxicity of the debate is perpetuated by adults, and that itself is unfair to the children who are caught in the middle of it. The children are being used as a football, and this is a group that we should be showing more compassion to. Now, when I coined the phrase footballification to describe an inability to admit that your own side could ever be remotely wrong or that the other side could ever be remotely right, I wasn't thinking of this issue. But it is, as I've just alluded to, it is among the best imaginable examples of what the phenomenon of footballification seeks to convey. And it is, I'm sure it's a coincidence that Hilary Cass has deployed football as the analogy for her dissection of the debate. But goodness me, the phrase that I use about having your football scarf, your red scarf or your blue scarf tied so tightly around your neck that it's cut off the flow of blood to your brain has never been more pertinent, has it? It's the most perfect illustration of what I try to describe when I talk about footballification. I usually talk about corner kicks on the television. When you see the vicious hatred on the face of fans being directed at a player kicking a ball in a different coloured shirt from the ones that they're wearing, and the adulation that they reserve for the people wearing the right coloured shirts, and the speed with which their allegiances will switch if the player changes teams and swaps shirts. It's insane. And I love football. Come on, you Reds. It's insane. But it's why she uses football as the example in this context. Part of the problem now, of course, is that very few people listening to this will think that they are the contorted face football fan spitting venom and hatred at the person who has the audacity to wear a different coloured shirt. But you might well be. Because if you've engaged in this debate at all, you've probably perpetuated some of the toxicity that Hilary Cass describes. Unless, of course, you've tried to do what I do, which is to say you're sometimes both as bad as each other. And then everybody hates you. But hey, that's my cross to bear, not yours. So here's the question. Why? Why is this conversation, which affects and concerns so few of us, and that's relevant in particular to the treatment of children with gender confusion, it affects and concerns so few of us, why is it so toxic? Why is the debate so toxic? Why is it so hard for so many to see that this, in the words of Hilary Cass, is unfair to the children who are caught in the middle of it? The children are being used as a football, and this is a group that we should be showing more compassion to. Why is it so toxic? And if you recognize a bit of yourself in her description, if you are somebody already perhaps sharpening your blades, baring your teeth, you perhaps could even be angry with this incredibly measured and well thought out introduction. Why do you think you are so, let's not say toxic, because most toxic people probably don't think they're toxic. But why do you think you are so passionate about this issue, given that it affects you personally, or even your children personally, not one jot? Because that's probably the thing that still confuses me the most. And perhaps one element as well that needs to be added to the mix before we open up the phone lines is that the evidence isn't there. Another of the points that Hilary Cass makes is that the both quotes sides, end quotes, claim to have support for their position, but neither of them do because the evidence isn't there. This is an area of remarkably weak evidence, she writes in a 398-page report that I don't imagine anybody has read yet. Yet results of studies are exaggerated or misrepresented by people on all sides of the debate to support their viewpoint. The reality is that we have no good evidence on the long-term outcomes of interventions to manage gender-related distress. So anyone claiming otherwise, even this morning, anyone giving you numbers or claiming that there is statistical evidence to support any given position on this is not just lying, of course, or being ignorant. It's often hard to tell the difference, but contributing, wittingly or unwittingly, to the toxicity of the debate that Cass describes as being perpetuated, forgive me, by adults. I mean, won't somebody think of the children? It's such a hackneyed cliche, isn't it? But occasionally it's... they are the only words that fully fit the picture in front of us. 24 minutes after 10 is the time. Kate's in Bishop's Stortford to kick things off. Kate, what would you like to say?
Several things. I'm the parent of a young man who's trans, and we've been through the journey with the Tavistock from just before there was... He became involved with the Tavistock just before there was the exponential rise in girls going there. So we've seen the whole thing. He's on hormone blockers and now on testosterone as well.
How old is he now?
He is coming up to 20.
Okay.
He's coming up to 20. So he's actually left the children's Tavistock and is under adult services.
And he would have started there or first made contact there at about the age of 11, I presume?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, but I would say at this point that he has always known that he was wrongly placed in his body. I mean, from the age of about... we first noticed things when he was about 3.
What did you notice? You're gone.
Just his... I mean, this is... I hate saying this because it sounds a bit odd, but I used to work in a preschool. Yeah. I've seen boys and girls play with all kinds of toys. You try not to gender define them or whatever. My son always gravitated to a specific way of being with toys and things. So, he's got an older sister. They both had baby dolls, but he always wanted male baby dolls.
Okay.
His avatars on game things were always male, and the toys that he selected tended to be, generalising here, male type toys.
And that's something that's something that could have ebbed and flowed as the years passed, but it clearly didn't ebb and flow. It became clearer and clearer that at the time it would have been in her mind's eye, she was a he. Yeah, and that, to the point where he was getting very distressed at a very young age because he didn't understand why he couldn't do boys' stuff. I hate these gender-specific things, but that's what was coming out of his mouth. And we'd be saying, yes, of course you can, come to football classes, do this, do that. But it was an internal feeling of being in the wrong body. Okay.
As far as the medications are concerned... it really, really upsets me quite profoundly when you hear people sort of saying that as a parent you're not thinking about your child, because it's so untrue. My husband and I... Well,
it's untrue. It's untrue in your case.
Okay. But basically, we were really not happy about our son going on to hormone blockers. We weren't happy about him going on to testosterone. But we recognised that it wasn't about how we felt about it and what we wanted in the situation. We had to do things because he was so profoundly distressed. Yeah. So profoundly distressed. It was that or the fear of losing your child. I mean, he left school at the age of 12 and never went back because his anxieties were so profound. He didn't even come out of his bedroom for a year, and he is not unusual in this. Right. And there are, he does have autism as well, and we always as parents, have made the connection between the transgender thing and the autism thing. But I also think...
Can I have a crack at explaining what you mean by connection? Because remember, this is a world you know intimately, and most people listening won't know at all. So I think the connection is that because autism can often, will usually leave children feeling very out of place. And that's why it leads to masking, and it leads to all sorts of stresses and tensions. Or autistic people look at the world around them and don't recognise themselves very often. So the theory is, or some thinking suggests, that because of that sense of displacement, they can rightly or wrongly end up thinking that they are in the wrong body and they would fit in better if they were in a different body. Have I got that right? Not really.
That's one way of looking at it.
Yeah.
I tend to, knowing my son, I tend to look at it from the point of view of, and the other trans kids that, are young people that I've met over time, it tends to be that they are kind of a lot more fluid about gender.
Just
bearing
generally.
in mind that gender is a constructed thing. It's not about biology. It's about what's going on in your brain.
So you think autism makes that an easier notion to grasp than it would be for perhaps for other people?
Absolutely.
Okay, that's a
and they're
different.
more open-minded about it.
Okay.
That's my personal take on it.
No, I think they're really helpful to sit alongside each other, and I get cast now as the skeptic, I suppose, but I was only expressing opinions I've heard and opinions that people certainly hold, but yours is compelling, actually.
There's. I think unless you're actually in a situation, either as a person who is trans or as a parent of somebody that is trans and is trying to help them along the journey that they have to go on, it is incredibly difficult to know what the right thing to do is.
Yes.
I just want my son to be happy and comfortable in his own skin, and that's all we've ever wanted.
Yes. And what about the idea? I tell you what, Kate, you weren't kidding when you said there was a lot of ground to cover at the beginning of this conversation, and we're already late for the news. So, in fact, what I might do is bring you back after the news. Is that all right? Because I think you're so in the heart of this in every imaginable way, up to and including. Being under the care of the Tavistock Clinic, that it would be foolish not to talk to you for as long as we can. So you wait there. We return to Kate. A quick word on statistics and proof, if you like, that Hilary Cass couldn't be more correct when she says this is an area of remarkably weak evidence. Results of studies are exaggerated or misrepresented by people on all sides of the debate. When I said earlier that arguably the only statistic that matters in the first instance is the statistic of people who transitioned, and then regretted it. And quite a few of you sent me the figure of 70%, which I thought was remarkable. Some of you claiming you heard it on LBC. That's just nonsense. I don't know whether you've misunderstood or whether you've been misinformed. But with Hilary Cass's words in the back of our mind, this is an area of remarkably weak evidence, then you can point at a review of 27 studies involving almost 8,000 teens and adults who had transgender surgeries, mostly in Europe, the US and Canada. And of that number, approximately 1% on average expressed regret. 1%. Now, another study, when you look at people who expressed regret, so if you twin the two studies together, if you look at that 1%, then the most common reason for detransitioning, for wanting to reverse the process, was the realization that their gender dysphoria was related to other issues. And that figure is 70%. So that's 1% of people regretting it, and 70% of the 1% regretting it because they realised that their gender dysphoria was related to other issues. So I'm just addressing that because the figure 70% has been sent to me a bunch of times already this morning. And those, as far as I can tell, but as Hilary Cass says, this is an area of remarkably weak evidence. As far as I can tell, that's where perhaps that number had come from. Kate is in Bishop's Stortford, the parent of a trans man who first attended the Tavistock at the age of 11 and whose parents wrestled, obviously, with the profound impact that puberty blockers would have on his young life and his young body. But the alternative was, I think it's fair to say, Kate, the alternative was misery.
Absolutely, yeah. He was extremely unhappy, suicidal, self-harming, not at school. That's been one of the hardest things to deal with. And I can say from knowledge of other parents and young people who are in the same kind of situation as my son, there is a pattern that they all seem to follow, which is basically feeling unhappy in themselves for whatever reason, but it's, the trans thing is there, and they end up leaving school because they don't feel comfortable there, and they just basically go down a hole, really, emotionally and psychologically.
And what happened? What happened when treatment started? How old was he when medication was first prescribed, and what happened?
He's sitting next to me here.
Hey!
Were you 14 or 15?
When I started blockers,
yeah.
I was 13 or 14, I think.
I don't know if you heard that.
Yes, I did, 13 or 14.
And then he started on testosterone when he was 16, I think. 18. Okay, sorry.
And well, I don't know who to ask first, but I'll ask Mum. What difference did you notice? What changes did you notice?
The hormone blockers kind of made him feel safe, because obviously at that age, young women start having puberty,
start developing,
and periods and things. So he was in a situation where he's never had periods. Sorry, Dylan. He hates me talking about his previous gender.
Yes.
So that was a big relief for him, I believe. Yeah. And then it seemed to take forever before he was allowed to have testosterone, which is right and proper, actually. From a parental point of view, we wanted to make sure that every avenue was checked, and that he was really thoroughly investigated psychologically before they put him on this. And it was just it was a life changer. He was just immediately happier in himself.
One of the things Hilary Cass says is that too many children got stuck on waiting lists and sort of languished there. So your experience was actually quite lucky at reading. Massively,
yes. Yeah. We came in at exactly the right point. Everybody that we know that has come along after us has really struggled, and it's because the kids can't even get on the waiting list for the Tavistock most of the time, or if they are on the waiting list, they have to wait for years.
I hear you. I do.
And that can be very damaging for them. But I do also, I think she said that there were, they think there is a connection between autism and... Yes.
Well, no, just a disproportionate representation. I don't know that she's gone for causation. Yeah. She's gone for correlation.
Yeah. And I remember the first day that we attended the Tavistock, we had to fill in a sort of checklist thing, and it was because I already knew that my son had autism, although he hadn't yet been diagnosed.
Yes.
But it was very obvious from the checklist that they were questioning that and looking at that in their questions. They were kind of slightly weighted, and I know other people have read the same checklist and thought, oh, okay, they're definitely investigating the autism thing. And I also know of one of the psychotherapists there that did a paper on it at one point, and the correlation between transgenderism and autism, and we firmly believe there is a connection.
Okay, and you've made a powerful case for why that might be. I'll finish, if I may, and I don't know which one of you, or ideally I suppose both of you might want to answer this. Why do you think it is, and I'm not going to read you some of the messages coming in that are proof of the toxicity directed personally at you and your son. That's a them problem. It's not a you problem until I read them out. But why do you think it is such a toxic debate? I
think I said to your researcher before I came on air, I think trans is the new gay, effectively. The same kind of venom that was probably expressed to gay people when it first became, more
mainstream
in society. It's the same kind of thing. And as my son so rightly said, people fear it. They don't understand it, so they fear it. And I think that's where the toxicity comes from. I really do. It's just, we've never encountered this before. It's out of our realm of experience. So let's stick the beat in, basically.
And there will be people who are hopefully poised to offer up a completely different answer to exactly the same question. Would your son agree with everything? And I appreciate he doesn't want to come on himself today. He'd agree with everything you said, I presume.
Yes. Yeah.
The toxicity.
Dylan? He's nodding.
Okay, well, thank you both, actually. That's a powerful and important beginning to the conversation, which is about you and Dylan. It's not actually about anybody else, except, of course, the people who may have been treated similarly and do regret it, or the people who may have benefited from being treated similarly and, as it stands now, are less likely to be. And that phrase there that runs through all of this. The toxicity of debate is exceptional. It must stop. Not much prospect of that, I'm afraid, glancing at some of the mainstream media this morning and much of the social media. The toxicity of debate is exceptional. It must stop. Because I suppose as long as people who deny the reality of what Kate has just described her son going through, or her son being, it's hard to imagine the toxicity dissipating. And just to stress, because some people have managed, including a couple of people on Twitter that normally are a little better than this. I'll read you this one. A sensible, balanced opening to the, quotes, trans issue, rather undermined by the last point, James. It only affects a few people. I'm talking about the treatment of children confused about gender. I'm not talking about anything else this morning. Thousands of children unsure of gender identity, Hilary Cass has found, were let down by the NHS. Kate and Dylan's experience, of course, was the opposite. But that doesn't affect a lot of people, and it has nothing to do with safe spaces or transgender toilets or any of those other elements of this debate. It's solely about children and the treatment of children, in every sense of the word treatment, who are unsure of their gender identity. So I'm afraid that my sensible, balanced opening to this conversation was not let down by the observation that the treatment of gender-confused children is something that only affects a tiny minority of the population and a tiny minority of the people engaged in the discourse. Sam's in Southampton. Sam, the toxicity, why? Why do we think?
I just think people are just scared of what they don't know, basically. They just aren't aware of what they see, and then they read something and are scared of maybe losing some of their rights, maybe.
And yet, the report that has come out today looks to a shortage of evidence. It describes studies being exaggerated or misrepresented by people on all sides of the debate. You're describing toxicity, I think, directed at transgender people, aren't you?
I am.
What about the toxicity directed at people who are sceptical of transgender people? Or let me choose my hang on. Let me choose my words a tiny bit more carefully. What about the toxicity directed at people like J.K. Rowling?
Yeah, that is abhorrent.
So where does that come from?
From other people who are scared about their rights, I guess, and their
Now, if you're a feminist, you're right to be scared about having your rights taken away. You can just look at Roe. You can look at Roe versus Wade in America. Something as fundamental to bodily autonomy as abortion legislation got undone thanks to Donald Trump. So protecting hard-won rights for biological women is a valid cause, and it goes far beyond simple irrational fear of the unknown, doesn't it?
It does. Indeed, it does, James.
So you're not clear any more than I am.
Clear.
No. I think we can speculate about where what is sometimes called transphobia comes from, but we can also be pretty clear about where fear of hard-won rights and spaces for biological women comes from. But if the conversation is confined exclusively to the care of children questioning their gender identity, then your point is more powerful than the counterpoint.
And we have to be very careful, James, don't we?
Why would anybody be cross with Kate for doing what she did and describing it in the way that she described? Care, concern, prioritising the mental health and the physical well-being of her child.
And why would you go on that journey if you didn't have care and love for your child? It's not a simple or straightforward journey, and there's plenty of grief and pain involved. And if my daughter changed her mind and said, actually, I want to be a boy tomorrow, I would celebrate that. But unfortunately, that is not going to happen. And, you know, I can ask her every day, but it's not going to change the fact of how she feels.
Because her life would be much easier if that were to happen. But it would be like asking her to change colour.
Exactly. I have other children. I'm not meant to change the way they were. So to ask my daughter to pretend that she's not is also wrong in my eyes.
I didn't know you had that personal involvement in the story. Has your daughter been treated? So my daughter, we first visited the Tavistock when my daughter was 6, right, and
that was 11 years ago. So she's in endocrine, she's on blockers. But, you know, it's not... we spent years and years speaking to psychologists before we were offered any help other than verbal.
Yes.
So it does seem it's all a political thing. You know, they released the school guidance a month ago before the Cass report. Why didn't they take note from the Cass report and then release the school guidance?
That's a political question, isn't it? What have you heard today? What do you make? Because I mean, it's 398 pages, but so far, what? Go on.
70% change their mind. I've heard 85% of them might be gay.
Right.
And it's...
Well, you haven't heard this from the Cass report, to be fair, Sam.
Not from the Cass report.
I don't know where you've heard this.
From your radio station,
Oh,
James.
really? Okay,
yeah,
well...
Unfortunately so.
Focusing exclusively on what is in the actual report, is it too early for you to either welcome it or...
It is too early.
Okay.
It's too early. From what I've heard in lots of other reports, it's a huge amount of word soup with not a great deal of action or meaning behind it, to be brutally honest.
And you've got more skin in the game than of course most people commenting on it or reacting to it. Sam, thank you. Amelia Gentleman is writing in The Guardian today and provides, I think, a helpful précis of some of the 398 pages. She talks about the review being written in a calmly clinical tone, but there are moments when her anger about how NHS England has cared for a generation of vulnerable children is barely disguised. And yet that anger is not about, or not exclusively about, or arguably not even about children being given drugs when they shouldn't have been given drugs. Her key beef seems to be with children being left to fend for themselves and not getting the psychological and mental health support, which you would need before going down a physical treatment path. So I think Sam perhaps has a point. The more you look at it, the less anyone can cling to the notion that this provides a neat full stop to some of the conversations and debates that unfold around transgender people. She knows, writes Amelia Gentleman, her recommendations will be hugely controversial and that some children waiting for treatment will be dismayed by her conclusions. But she is adamant that she has young people's best interests at heart. We've let them down because the research isn't good enough and we haven't got good data. The toxicity of the debate is perpetuated by adults, and that itself is unfair to the children who are caught in the middle of it. As the conversation continues, the central conclusion of Hilary Cass's report is that thousands of vulnerable children questioning their gender identity have been let down by the NHS providing unproven treatments and by the toxicity of the trans debate. Responsibility for the first bit lies with NHS professionals. Responsibility for the second bit in some ways lies with all of us, because even if you haven't engaged in the toxicity of the debate itself, perhaps you could have done more to diffuse it. I'm not sure you could. That's why I use the word perhaps. The UK's only NHS gender identity development service used puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, which masculinise or feminise people's appearance, despite what Dr. Hilary Cass calls remarkably weak evidence that they improve the well-being of young people and concern that they may harm health. So the reason why one commentator writes in The Guardian today about her conclusions arguably representing very, very bad news for young people currently waiting for treatment lies, I think, within that bit of her findings there. She's a leading consultant paediatrician, and she has stressed, and I think some media commentators have elected to gloss over this bit of the report, she has stressed that her findings were not in any way intended to undermine the validity of trans identities or challenge people's right to transition. So there is the toxicity. Some people think transitioning is impossible. You cannot become a woman if you were born a biological male. And yet Hilary Cass has given no support whatsoever to those people, despite some of them, perhaps predictably, already trying to claim some sort of vindication or victory. When reports like this are published, everyone claims vindication. Literally, everybody will claim vindication. The more toxic a debate is, the more any intervention sees everybody claim vindication. The only people vindicated, and I would say this, wouldn't I, here today are the ones that have focused more on the toxicity perhaps than on anything else, because until you get rid of the toxicity, you're not going to help anyone. Rachel is in Sheffield. Rachel, what would you like to say?
I don't really know. Today I'm just kind of sad, to be honest.
Tell me why.
Well, the Cass report's been going on for like 3 years, and everyone's been Kemi Badlock's been going, oh, this is in the Cass report, that's in the Cass report, all of my evidence is in the Cass report, and then... Well,
there was an interim report, wasn't there?
And now it's come out with all this guidance saying, oh, well, now we can extend this into the adult service. And I'm like, well, if you do this to the adult service, it's going to cripple the adult service. Because I went through the adult service, and the adult service barely coped when it came up with a complex need. So I'm kind of terrified, to be honest, for anyone that's actually in the adult service.
So you're talking about and this is the bit that has already come out, the NHS England shutting the GIDS, and therefore insisting that routinely under 18s will receive psychological support rather than medical intervention, which we've already spoken to 2 parents this morning for whose children that would have been in their eyes, and there'll always be a Billy bunch of numbers on Twitter who knows their children better than they do. Let me just find you. Well, here's one here. Your callers, James, demonstrate why the Tavistock had to close and why this report is so necessary. Taking a 6-year-old to a gender clinic, putting an autistic child on puberty blockers. Thank goodness this insanity has finally been called out. So there's someone who knows these children better than their own parents, and indeed better than some of the doctors that help. But that psychological support rather than medical intervention pushes the medical intervention into the adult care system, which you are describing as inadequate, I think.
Yes, so for example, I went to the Porterbrook Clinic, which is like 25 minutes from my house. They only have 2 psychiatrists on staff, neither of which are trained in complex psychiatric needs. So when I actually needed complex psychiatric help, the community mental health team in Sheffield said, oh, well, just go to Porterbrook and they'll help you. And then Porterbrook said, we can't deal with this, go to the community mental health team, and ended up getting a year-long argument between the 2 of them where neither of them would help me. And during that entire time, I didn't get any help from either, and I just got stuck without any help and then had to submit complaints to both clinics. And can you imagine if this happened after this report came out? This is why I'm kind of terrified of what the Cass report would do to the adult service.
Yeah. And I understand why. Although I also understand why the idea of giving puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones to children, and the younger you are, I understand why the more concern it generates.
Yeah, I mean, I might be an exception here, but I'm very much the opinion that, puberty blockers cut off at the Gillick competency at 16. It may just be because of where I work that seems to be a good cut-off, and that. So you shouldn't have them until you're 16. Yeah, it's the 16.
And the Gillick competency, I think, refers to your GP having a responsibility to tell your parents if you want contraception.
But I mean, 16 seems to be a bit
a helpful age.
Helpful age and good cut off. But I understand that's not perfect for everyone. So your sadness is logistic, isn't it, rather than emotional? You just think this is going to make the situation worse for people like you. Well, bearing in mind the fact that some of the gender identity clinics have got waiting times of excess in 10 years. and you're suddenly asking them, well, oh, you need to do complex mental health support, neurological support. Bear in mind that some of the ADHD and autism clinics also have waiting times of in excess in 10 years.
Yeah.
And also chromosomal support. I mean, some of those clinics also have waiting times of excess of 5 years. And their funding is already being strapped because of austerity.
And that's unlikely to get better anytime soon. And this arguably will make that situation worse. Can I ask you, as a trans woman, why you think this debate is so toxic? And if you can, you don't have to, but if you can focus on the treatment of children unsure of gender identity, which you used to be, why is that element of the conversation so toxic? It's
people don't understand trans people, and it's a rehash of a rehash. So it's the whole Anita Bryant thing from the United States. Think of the children.
I don't know that.
And,
I don't know.
Anita Bryant was a person from Florida, and it was a whole thing from the 70s.
Okay.
And she was just like, oh, think of the children. We can't allow gay people in our schools and stuff like that. And then people then did it for the gays here and back in the 80s as well. And it was, I'll think of the children. But I mean, it's just people fear what they don't know, and then it doesn't really matter. And it could be that there's only 5 trans people and they'd still do exactly the same thing. It's the same with the medical evidence. There's never going to be enough medical evidence for them to accept trans people. We could find out the exact gene that causes trans people to be trans people, and wouldn't really matter.
Because it's a denial of your reality, or denial of your existence.
Exactly. It won't.
But it's not. That's not what Hilary Cass has done. She's not denying your existence. She stresses that her findings are not intended. Well, maybe she has unintentionally done it in that case, I suppose, to undermine the validity of your identity or challenge your right to transition.
Yeah, it's all in the nuance.
Isn't it? She thinks she is seeking to improve the care of the fast-growing number of children and young people with gender-related distress.
Yeah, and she's trying to create a service that's so expensive to run that the Tories just won't ever run it.
And what happens
Labour
then?
won't ever run it.
And what happens then?
They all have to be a private service, which will have to be shared care with a GP that won't run it because he won't do the shared care because the GP can't afford it. Which is what's happening right now with the private gender care clinic.
Would you agree with this? For most young people, a medical pathway will not be the best way to manage their gender-related distress. For those young people for whom a medical pathway is clinically indicated, it is not enough to provide this without also addressing wider mental health and or psychosocially challenging problems.
Depends.
You cop out.
It depends. I mean, if someone is, say, autistic and trans,
yes,
it makes sense to address the autistic part first and then address the trans part second. Maybe.
Okay.
Like for me, because I had a complex mental health issue, it made sense to address the complex mental health issue first and then address the trans part second. But that was just me.
And that does sound pretty similar to one element of what Hilary Cass is concluding. Rachel, thank you. We may talk again when you've read more of it. I don't know where this conversation is going. But there is so much toxicity on all sides, is something about which most people would agree. But of course, some of the people engaging in the toxicity don't realise they're doing so. I'll show you what I mean. And I'm not 100% sure what quote sides, end quotes, of this conversation Emma in Edinburgh thinks she's on. She says, you talk about the toxic debate, but what there is one side that's refused to debate and do any research, and another side saying, please look at this is not normal. That's toxic. I mean, whichever way you're putting it, you're saying one side's got all the right on their side and the other side's got none, which is kind of the definition of what Hilary Cass is talking about when she describes children as being used as a football. Why do you think it's toxic? Mike says because the far right want to use it as a wedge issue, like the boats. There's a big American neo-Nazi money introducing trans people. Pretty strong stuff, Mike. Dan brings 30p Lee into the mix. People like him using it to incite further anger and confusion as an electoral wedge. Please don't use my name. I've got to be careful on that. I think a lot of the toxicity for the debate comes from this, James. Many trans people come from a background of being bullied, and although this may have changed, statistically they have experienced sexual assault. This means that when the other quotes, side end quotes, suggests that a trans person should be kept out of the toilet, it feels like a personal attack. So rather than logic kicking in, emotion often kicks in. This in itself is an issue because it means that you're saying most trans people are mentally ill. I myself am transitioning and have been sexually assaulted multiple times, but if I highlight this to the trans community, it immediately explodes. Another interesting aspect is that the private sector seems to be speeding through treatment. Therapy took me less than 3 sessions to get onto HRT, but maybe that's because I was so certain I wanted to transition and had wanted to for as long as I can remember. I understand what you're saying. But of course that is a contribution to a conversation about something a bit different from the medical treatment of children. And Chris says, please will you remember that there are trans boys and trans men as well, that girls transition to male. The first caller, Chris, perhaps you tuned in a little late, and I'm not saying that snarkily, but the very first caller was talking to us about her transgender sons. I mean, it's tough, isn't it? And I don't necessarily offer up this observation with huge amounts of generosity. But if you have listened to the parents and the transgender people talking on air today, and you do see yourself as being on the other side of the argument, I don't want to put words into your mouth, but I don't have to. I've got texts, I suppose, that could do that. People denying the reality of what they have described, people denying the validity of what they have described, then Hilary Cass's report certainly hasn't vindicated you. She's gone out of her way to stress that she's doing neither of those things. She's not in any way questioning the reality of the process or indeed the status. But if you are on the other, quote, side of the football pitch and you think that it should be harder for children to access some elements of the treatment that they have been able to access, then I'd like you to tell me why it is so toxic, because your position isn't particularly pungent in and of itself. You know, Rachel, a trans woman, suggested 16. We've already spoken to the parents of children who received medication before that age. You've got to put the line somewhere, particularly for trans men. The physical development that comes with puberty is quite frightening, quite traumatic as a prospect. But why do you think it is so toxic? Sarah is in Elephant and Castle. Sarah, what would you like to say?
Hiya.
Hello.
Yes, I'm a mum of a trans teen, and the medical care has been non-existent from the NHS. So we've had to do it all ourselves. You know, initially it was me and Google. Okay?
Right. That's suboptimal.
It is, but that's now it's like that for everyone.
Yes.
Anyone who's got somebody who's under 16 is having to do it themselves. Now, my child has always known. I didn't know. She's always known. And then she told me at 11. So initially you don't do anything with this kind of information. You kind of just go, okay. And then you kind of start, because it's something that I had never thought about. It wasn't even in my world. Like, you know, I don't know anyone transgender. Oh, I didn't then, now. Anyway, so then at 13, she said it again. You know, we're a very liberal family. So I said, look, if you are, you are. If you're not, you're not. It's fine. You know. And then at 13, it was time to start doing something serious about this. And so, you know, at 11, we went to the doctor. The doctor said, there's nothing I can do. I can put you on a waiting list. I said, fine, go for it. Put on the waiting list, and then we shelved that. Life carried on. And then at 13, I went back, and we were still sort of 3 or 4 years out from the NHS care, and he couldn't do anything to help me. He knew nothing about the process that he could advise me on. Yeah. So I phoned a doctor in Spain, and I used them as a consultant, and I asked them, what's the process? Like step by step, what you do. You know, so if you've got a cold and you go to the doctor, he does an assessment, and you either, you know, the first is, okay, you need antibiotics, you need erythromycin. If you take that and that doesn't work, you go back, they give you something else. You know, there's like a flowchart of events that happen.
Yes.
And in Spain, with transgender issues, if a family goes in and they've got a child that's transgender, that sets off protocols. And the first thing that happens is they get immediately referred to psychologists.
Yes.
Okay? Psychologists or psychiatrists, depending on the situation. One for the child and one for the family. Okay, so it's unbelievably good. And then it starts from there, yeah? Nothing in this world of trans issues is quick. None of it. And nor should it be, right? But it shouldn't be transphobic either. Then they told me what to do. Yeah, they said they advised puberty blockers because everyone needs hormones, right? So people keep talking about puberty blockers and they're terrible. And I looked into it, and the one that I gave my child had been around for 30 years.
Right.
Yeah? Patented in the 70s, launched in the 80s. Been around for 30 years. Right? And so there's plenty of evidence as to what puberty blockers do. Now, the truth is...
that's a challenge to some of what Cass has said, I think, isn't it?
I mean, look, that might not be as much as she would like, but there is evidence, you know. And also the use of puberty blockers, right? It's a temporary thing.
Yes.
Yeah, you shouldn't use puberty blockers for more than 2 years.
Right.
The effects are reversible, yeah, because all it does is block hormones, but everybody needs hormones, so you shouldn't use them long term. They're not a solution. You have to choose whether you have male hormones or female hormones. And the changes from the hormones, those are permanent, okay? But the changes from the hormones that you get if you go through puberty are also permanent, which is why puberty blockers are so essential when they're young. Yeah. The question is when you take them. So for us, what we did is we went and tried to preserve fertility. That took me about 50 phone calls, by the way, to different companies. Right. And we wanted to preserve fertility. And so we went in, got tested. Sperm wasn't there yet. Yeah. so we waited. And then every sort of 4 or 5 months, they went back, did tests. And then the sperm were there. And they were like, fine, freeze it. Let's do it. And so we froze the sperm, so we preserved fertility. And then she went on puberty blockers, okay? And so she was on puberty blockers for a while.
This sounds like a full-time job, Sarah, for you.
It's not really. You know, you just got... only because I got this doctor in Spain,
right,
to tell me what to do. And then...
And is the doctor... Sorry to interrupt you. You're saying too much interesting stuff. I don't want to let any of it slip away. Was the doctor in Spain an outlier? Is the doctor in Spain like an international figure?
No. They're more open. As Catholic and sexist as I've always thought Spain to be. I'm Spanish, by the way, before hate.
No, I figured you were, but thank you for clarifying.
Yeah. That they have been remarkable. Yeah. The extended family in Spain, beyond remarkable. I mean, really, really good. But anyway, we digress. The point is that then... Yes.
Go on.
So we had puberty blockers, but at the same time, I found a clinical psychologist in this country, a fantastic one, right? I don't know if I can say the name or not. You know, normally trans people talking about trans things are discreet to name it because of the haters.
Sure. Yeah? Well, steer clear then. I don't want it to bring any trouble to anybody's doorstep.
No, but this doctor was phenomenal, okay. Right? And so we saw her, but really expensive, right? I was paying £275 a time, okay? Yeah. You know? And then, so she went through that process with the clinical psychologist, and the clinical psychologist, who's got more than 20 years experience in this area, said, I do believe that this change is likely to be permanent. Okay, so then we waited another 6 months, and she started female hormones. Right. You know, so the process takes a long time.
If every transgender child or every child questioning their gender had the support and the experience that you describe, I'm not sure there'd have been anything for Hilary Cass to investigate.
No, there wouldn't be, you know, and the Tavistock, you know, they may have made mistakes, right?
Well, they did make mistakes. I think we know they made mistakes. There's some very well-documented cases of people suffering profound regret at the treatment they received.
But let me give you a couple of different examples, right? There was that crazy nurse that killed all those babies, yeah? Yeah. And that was because of a lack of processes in that hospital. And the reaction wasn't to shut that maternity unit down. You see, the reaction was, we must never let this happen again. How do we fix that? Yeah. They didn't shut it down, right? You have women. Another example that I'm going to give you is, you know, women having abortions, right? Of course, there are going to be women that regret it, but you don't turn around and close all the abortion clinics in the southeast because 1% of women regret it. You don't close them down, which is what they effectively did.
And that's what you think you're hearing today is that you find a small minority of people who've undergone something who regret undergoing it, and the response you think you're seeing and hearing is that you therefore make it much harder or make it impossible until you're much older for people to receive similar treatment.
I don't even think it's trans people causing this problem. I think it's haters. They've invented this. They've invented a problem that doesn't exist, right? Trans women going into women's toilets. I mean, I don't know anybody or know anybody that knows anybody that's ever had an issue in a toilet. Right?
No, but I do. Right? I do. And also I'll get 100 more now by 11:25.
I'm sure you will.
And they won't. And most of them will be telling me the truth. So it does happen. It does exist. And people tell me. Someone I know, a friend of mine, told me quite recently about their daughter being in a toilet and someone coming in, and it made their daughter uncomfortable. It happens.
But who came in? A trans woman or a man?
Well, some people would say, what's the difference, wouldn't they?
Because a cis man pretending to be a woman
is a threat.
Who is a predator.
But a genuine trans woman is not. But the admission of the trans woman makes the entry of the cis man much easier, is I think the argument, although it's not one I fully...
But then the problem you have as well, right, there's that trans boxer, I can't remember his name, he just got knocked out. Trans man, right, he's a boxer.
Yeah.
So he was natal woman, right? But he's a boxer, so you can imagine the muscles and the size.
Yeah.
Right? So he would be able to go into a woman's toilet. That would be more threatening, I think, if, you wanted to be scared or something.
You make a point. I tried to leave the toilets out of it today, Sarah, and we've done a pretty good job so far, but I understand, because now you're talking about the toxicity, which is a question I hadn't actually articulated yet, so I will now. You've begun to answer it. Where does this level of toxicity come from, including from people who are supportive of transgender children?
So I think the toxicity comes from a made-up source. I think it's just political.
No, but what about the other side? Because what about the toxicity directed, for example, at J.K. Rowling? Where does that come from? Well,
because J.K. Rowling is transphobic. Okay.
You see, that's a toxic contribution to the conversation.
I understand, but look, a racist person doesn't like to be called racist any more than a transphobic person likes to be called transphobic. Now, somebody who denies gender identity, the existence of gender identity, that is transphobic. That would be like.
But I don't think she does she? Doesn't she say she recognises the existence of gender identity? But
no, she doesn't.
Whatever your gender identity is, you can never be a biological male or female. No.
Trans people don't say that you can be a biological woman.
No, you probably followed her comments more closely than I have, to be fair.
I mean, I try not to, but it does come, you get the algorithms and it comes.
So the toxicity, you're almost saying that the toxicity directed at her is justified, which is unhelpful, isn't it, in some ways?
I don't think that there should be toxicity, right? So she shouldn't be getting hate. She should be getting education. Now, I think some trans people try to educate her. They try to explain why they were so upset. And look, don't get me wrong, right? When I first got into this world because of my daughter, I was one of the people that used to say, but why is J.K. Rowling transphobic? She's just protecting women's rights. I don't. That was my statement. I actually said that out loud to my daughter. And she said, what are you protecting them from? And that's where I began to educate myself. And then I changed my mind because I realized I was wrong, because what I was protecting them from was from something made up. If
so the threat. So it's not made up, is it? It's just and we're going to run out of time. But I need to get this right, because the invasion of women-only spaces by cis men pretending to be trans women.
That's a different thing.
Yes, but it's real.
But
it might be overrepresented.
But you have to protect women from that.
But again, we're back to punishing innocent people for the putative crimes of guilty people, aren't we? We're punishing all trans women for the actions of non-trans women.
Yeah.
And that seems quite an unfair thing to do. Just very briefly, Christine says this is such a difficult situation. We'd all agree with that. I don't think J.K. Rowling is transphobic. I think she's a feminist. Just address that for me if you can quickly.
I'm a feminist. Of course I'm a feminist. I'm a woman, and I'm glad to hear it.
I'm Spartacus.
I'm a woman and I'm a feminist. Of course I am. But I don't, and I want women, I want people, the world, to protect women. Protect women from those idiots that catcall down the road. Protect women from domestic abuse situations. Protect women from real danger. Saying that you're protecting women from trans women, I think, is ridiculous. ridiculous. Most trans women are so vulnerable. They're so vulnerable because this is such a tough road.
That becomes clear every time we open the phone lines on this issue. I know I said I'd finish, but how is your daughter getting on?
I mean, she's great.
Good.
She's great. We had a little transphobic bump in school with the leadership, not with the students or most of the teachers.
Right.
That was a little bit rubbish, but it's okay. It's okay.
And she's got you. I always speak to mums like you, and I start immediately worrying for the children who don't have mums like you. It's exemplary, the concern and the care that you've shown and described. Thank you. And I don't know whether she invites or relishes it, but it does often come back to J.K. Rowling because she has become such a powerful and prominent maypole for one side of this debate, although I'm still not 100% confident describing what side she is on. I balk at the use of the phrase transphobic because it seems to me to be a hefty accusation, but many of you are pretty clear that the cap fits. This from Emma. From my point of view, genuinely personal, she is transphobic. When someone denies my identity, they're calling me not just mentally incompetent, they're calling me subhuman. Any response to that insult is now being labelled as toxic, and they stress once again, from my point of view. And they add, my sapphic-oriented timeline is full of butch lesbians being punched for their assumed gender. How is it feminist to stoke that violence? Which means, I think, and they'll correct me pretty quickly if I'm wrong, that a lesbian who looks butch is being accused regularly on a lesbian-heavy timeline of not actually being a woman at all. And the question then is, how is it feminist to stoke that violence? From Frida, who is in Manchester. Frida, what would you like to say?
Hiya, thanks for taking my call.
You're very welcome.
Well, I've been in the mire of this debate for quite some time, and I've been a guest on various TV shows, and I was on Nick Ferrari's show not long ago, and what I've noticed is there are certain people being censored in this debate. Now, I don't want to mention too many names, but it keeps being like a distraction technique. So we keep talking about J.K. Rowling,
yes,
and we keep talking about these people, and what it does is it stops people talking about the real issue. So when something like this happens, when the Cass review comes out, it's all focused through a lens of transphobia. I will use that word. Now, personally...
Well, it hasn't been today. J.K. Rowling popped up once or twice for reasons, but the conversation we've been having since 10 o'clock this morning has been incredibly illuminating. And nobody's been silenced. Nobody's been silenced.
This is what I'm saying. This is the first time I've heard so many parents of trans people speak, because it's very rare. Because the only reason I've got into the media is by ringing up producers and saying, you got this wrong here, can you please... And that's... I'm not a journalist. I write a blog, that's what I do, and I just collect information. So it's so frustrating to hear the word trans constantly and hear your life being talked about. I mean, I work as a volunteer with the LGBT Foundation in Manchester, and I just see a lot of traumatised young people.
Yes. Let me ask you then, where do you think what Hilary Cass describes as toxicity comes from?
I think it's a very divisive issue, and I'm very reticent to say both sides, but there are both sides.
Yes.
But I think it's created by a very right-wing media, to put it mildly. The Daily Mail, the Telegraph. They seem to be captured by lobbyists, and I'm sure you've heard of the Policy Exchange. I'm sure you've heard of the IEA, and they release documents. They release documents to the government.
I know the Policy Exchange has. I didn't know IEA had. So there is, but that is these secretly funded so-called think tanks that gravitate around Tufton Street are always trying to manipulate the political discourse in favour of whoever it is that secretly funds them, and distraction from, for example, wealth inequality and wealth distribution has been in their arsenal since Andrew Neil first invited one of their godfathers to write for the Sunday Times 150 years ago. So I kind of get that side of it. Briefly, if you would. What are you feeling today, having had the chance to hear or look at some of what Hilary Cass has concluded?
Well, I'm just in the process of writing some bullet points about it, and I think what a lot of people are misconstruing this as sort of an expose of some kind of abuses that have been going on against children.
It's not that, is it? You can't really read the words she's written and arrive at that conclusion.
What the conclusion I've come to is quite a dense document, so
yes, it is.
I wouldn't claim to have read it all, but what comes out of it is the NHS is failing, and this is the tip of a very big mental health iceberg. Yes. And unfortunately, trans children get processed through a mental health pathway. So I had a friend who took her own life while she was waiting on a pathway. Now, there's a lot of complex reasons why somebody might take their own life. I accept that. It's not just one doctor's decision. It's not just one but the fact that she was on a mental health pathway when she could have just been supported by a local group or a counsellor.
Well, it would still, I see what you mean. So it would still be a mental health pathway, but it would be somehow bespoke and tailored towards transgender or gender confusion rather than being lumped in with all other mental health treatments. Go on.
What I'm saying is, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but what I'm saying is the NHS is failing, and this is the tip of a very big iceberg.
And everyone agrees on that. It's a bizarre one, isn't it? So I'm just cracking on only because I want to squeeze in one more call. If I can, before the news. So I'll be a little bit late for the news, but I want to hear from Scott, who's in Lanark. What made you pick up the phone, Scott?
It was just what you were saying at the start of the kind of intro there, James. Thanks for taking my call, first of all. It's just, I think my opinions on the whole subject, the whole issue have changed quite considerably over a number of years. And I think the biggest issue that most people face is with no frame of reference for it. When you look at any other polarising issue, you can see both sides of it. You look at the situation in the Middle East, you understand the history, the context, why people feel what they feel. With this, as I believe the term's a cis male, I just don't have any concept of not being comfortable with who I am. Yeah. And I think I think that can lay doubt in people's minds. So without having the frame of reference to understand where people are coming from...
Does it make us feel threatened when we don't understand? Somebody says, I am a transgender man, I am a transgender woman, and we feel threatened in somehow in ourselves by that? Because what made you negative towards it, do you think? It can't be just confusion, because confusion's not a negative force.
Yeah, I was never anti, but I certainly I was very sceptical. I was doubtful, and when you don't understand things, you try to rationalise it in potentially negative ways. And the big thing for me is I challenged why I felt the way I felt, and it boiled down to a lack of understanding. And as long as the issue is as polarised as it is, I don't think we're going to get anywhere without sitting down rationally and trying to take some emotion out of it.
And that probably involves an acceptance of the reality of the existences that we've heard described on the programme today, and there are still plenty of people uncomfortable with that. And that's where perhaps the parallels with homosexuality and homophobia do apply. The calls I took on this programme until relatively recently, and I'm sure I'd take them again if we opened up the phone lines, denying the existence of homosexuality, claiming that it's not a thing, it's impossible, God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, all of those things. People would not acknowledge the reality of, thought it was fake or some weird attention-seeking choice. That reminds us, as people, of course, queue up to insist that transgender people are mentally ill or mistaken or wrong. There are parallels there, and I think Scott's probably right that resolution or improvement in the situation for everybody, but particularly for these children, probably involves paying a little bit less attention to them. I don't know. I sound like Jerry Springer now doing final thoughts, but yeah, there must be a way to protect everyone's rights, whether female or transgender, says Caroline, and I think there probably is. It's just a question of appetite. I would just take a moment to say thank you to everybody who's been in touch to compliment us here, because you have to remember that Roxy and Eleanor answer the phones as well, and it can be quite a fraught issue, this one. So we do appreciate your comments about how well handled that entire conversation was and how compelling the callers were. I'll read one, just because to read more would be self-indulgent. Listening to the callers like your last one, James, is the reason that I tune into your show. She provided such clarity to the debate. What an amazingly clear and concise summary of the situation at present with NHS treatment and waiting times too. And then for balance, Jean's been in touch in capital letters to say these are children with a mental illness. And the danger, I guess, is to see those two as representative of the two sides that Hilary Cass describes. And that's probably doing a disservice to other people on the same side of this argument as Jean. But you might want to wonder why you're on the same side of the argument as Jean. I don't know.